So good evening and welcome to the closing session for this year's China Week, hosted by the Lao China Institute here at King's College London. It's been a long, very rich and stimulating series of events this week. We've had panels, we've had talks, we've had book readings, we've had poetry readings, calligraphy sessions, student taster sessions, and all centered on this year's theme of China and the New World Order. Over the past 5 days, we've explored how China, as the world's second largest economy, is reshaping global landscapes economically, technologically, geopolitically, and in many other ways as well. Some of it has been very uplifting, so hearing about how and what we can learn from China's example in several domains, how we can engage with China positively in the future, and how we can contribute to what Vince Cable called in our opening address here in this room on Monday, the forging of a new world. Summer's been a bit more concerning. I was particularly disturbed on Wednesday when we learned that the EU is so far behind East Asia technologically that we are perhaps unlikely to catch up in my lifetime or indeed at all. That was a low point of the week, but it was extremely interesting nonetheless. Across the week, we have engaged with scholars and policymakers, practitioners, students from here in King's, London, the UK, Europe, and around the world. And in so doing, I hope, have deepened our collective understanding of both opportunities and challenges in the UK, China, and wider global context. I have certainly learned a lot. Such conversation as we've been able to facilitate this week is all the more crucial, I think, in the current environment of flux and uncertainty across the world. In fact, when we first thought of a theme for this year's China Week, some colleagues suggested we ought to call it the New World Disorder rather than Order. We didn't go for that, but it was tempting. So as the kind of debates that are raging about trade, diplomacy, innovation, technology, disruption, global governance become more and more complex, events such as this week hopefully remind us of the power of rigorous research and open dialogue and community engagement and all the things that we want to promote. Before we get started on tonight's event, I have a whole long list of people that I need to thank. I will inevitably forget somebody, but hopefully not. Here goes. So, heartfelt thanks are due to our contributors, starting from Sir Vince Cable, economist and author and former politician, on Monday, Sir Malcolm Rifkin, former Foreign Secretary, a vast number of other guests, including writer Xiaolu Guo, who gave us a marvelous book reading last night. Tonight's guests, of course, Elizabeth Ingleson and Kaiser Kuo, who I will say a bit more about in a moment. Colleagues from across King's, of course, including Lao China Institute, obviously, but also the Business School, the Department of European and International Studies, Department of Culture, Media and Creative Studies. Current and former PhD students, it's been lovely to see them taking part enthusiastically this week. In particular, Mark Marmino, Linda Calabrese have done a lot. Former students and recent graduates who sang the praises of our master's program, and we didn't even have to pay them to do it this afternoon. That's Thomas, Georgiana, Rocky, and Mariana. I also need to thank our event partners, China Britain Business Council, Dialogue Earth, SACU, British Chamber of Commerce in China, Young China Watchers, Institute of Directors for China, Great Britain China Centre, Chinese Cinema Project, and the King's Language Centre. All of the support teams at King's here who have made this work this week, made everything function, including King's venues for the rooms and all the caterers who've provided the food. There will be more food and drink tonight, by the way, in the room opposite. So when we wrap up in here, head straight through the doors and over there to enjoy some more of King's hospitality. I should also thank the audience, obviously, you, everybody who's participated in discussions and asked interesting questions, and I'm sure you're going to tonight as well, without whom this week really wouldn't be worth doing. And of course, I also have to thank enormously importantly, the people who have really made this week come together. That is Amy Lai, our events officer, and the person without whom none of this would have been possible at all, our fantastic impact and engagement manager, Shafali Shah. Please come up, I've got a small token of our thanks for you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
I can't clap because I've got a handful of flowers. Thank you, Shafali. Well, I didn't get to clap because I was clutching a mic and a large bouquet, but I hope Shafali knows how much I appreciate her and Amy's work this week. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our chair for this evening. I'm going to let her introduce our speaker, but I'm going to introduce the chair. So we are honoured this evening to welcome Elizabeth Ingleson, Associate Professor of International History at LSE, just over the road. She is the author of Made in China, When US-China Interests Converge to Transform Global Trade, which I have a copy of right here. I recommend that you read it, published by Harvard University Press last year. Elizabeth has also published articles and chapters on US-China relations and US capitalism, and is currently writing another book, which is a productivity I can only dream of. Her next book is China and the United States since 1949. Elizabeth was previously at Yale, University of Virginia, Southern Methodist University, and had her PhD in history from the University of Sydney. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Ingleson, who is going to chair our closing presentation in discussion with Kaiser Kuo, who I will let her introduce, and offering some final thoughts to wrap up China Week 2025.
We have some very excellent high-tech mic happening here. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, to see you all, and to be part of what I think is a really, really important topic, culminating an extraordinarily important set of weeks-long set of conversations about China and its place in the world. I suppose to speak of the significance of US-China relations today it requires almost no introduction and requires, if anything, sometimes for us all to step back a little and perhaps just cover our eyes for a moment or so. But it's a real pleasure to be in conversation here tonight about such a significant topic with Kaiser Kuo, who I assume for many of you in this room also needs no introduction, but I'm going to embarrass him and do so anyway. Kaiser is a founder and prolific podcaster of the Sinica Podcast, which you should be listening to for anyone interested in China. I tell all of my students to listen to it. It's like a core component. Actually, I haven't told you this, Kaiser. Core component of some of my syllabuses and teaching.
The check is in the mail.
The check is in the mail. Thank you. A really, really, I think, important sort of way to sort of get an understanding of China from a really thoughtful and wide perspective. Kaiser has interviewed a whole range and continues to interview a whole range of people on the topic. Kaiser is also, and I have permission to say this, a rocker. Kaiser is the guitarist, I've just learnt, in his rock band, which at least is based in China. Mm-hmm. But do you perform elsewhere?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Germany, we've played in Germany.
Lao China Center. Yeah. Perhaps that could be the sort of international unveiling.
Bigger stage.
Perhaps the bigger stage. But it's a real pleasure to be here with you, Kaiser.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I wanted to sort of pick your brains about is a recent essay that you've written that I have here, printed out because I'm a historian and I like things to be written down and printed, unfortunately. But it's a really, really significant piece. It's written in the Ideas Letter, which, again, if you're not familiar with, is a very, very thoughtful and interesting space for thinking about academic ideas and controversial spaces. So Kaiser has recently written a piece in that space entitled The Great Reckoning. And it's a very thoughtful and considered and quite provocative call to arms, really, a call for a great reckoning. So I wondered if you could speak to us about this reckoning that you are calling for, this, and I'm quoting here, the intellectual challenge of acknowledging the scale of China's transformation. And the ways in which China's growth, this transformation that has occurred, is challenging us to rethink modernity. Kaiser, this is a really, really fundamental and really important point. Could you talk to us about this? Explain what you mean.
Sure. I know it's an enormous topic, and it was daunting. It was actually kind of a difficult thing to decide to sit down and to start to write. And maybe I could say a few words about what the impetus for it was, because I think this is really important. And I think there are people in this room who I would need to credit with helping me to like sort of get to the point where I would be willing to write such a thing. More generally, what I realized something about myself, which is that I have a certain timidity when it comes to saying things that are already, I think, blindingly obvious to people sometimes who are outside of the field itself. So in recent months and in recent years, really, I've had a series of conversations with people who are in fields that are adjacent to China studies, but are not themselves steeped in China studies itself. That is, they are not speakers of the Chinese language, but they are specialists in other things in developmental economics. For example, Jostein Hauge over here at Cambridge, Adam Tooze, people who also are in, but have, I found, more courage to actually say the thing sometimes. I see Jane Hayward sitting in the front here, who's here at King's, and Kerry Brown, who I hope will be arriving if he's not already here, but people who I think demonstrate a kind of courage that often I see absent in a lot of us who are very ensconced in the establishment, as it were. And I took a little inspiration from that. They're often willing, either as brave insiders or as maybe naive outsiders, to say the thing, to see the full dimensions of the transformation that we've seen in China, and to be able to pronounce on it pretty boldly and without so much equivocation. And I wanted to try to do the same thing. So that was really why I decided to try to do this. And I just thought the immediate impetus was a conversation I had over the summer with Adam Tooze. He spent a few days with me actually in a little mountain town in Yunnan province where we had a lot of conversations, some of them very beery, which may have given him courage, but certainly did for me. He was making pretty profound claims about the ways in which China's transformation is something that the strategic class in the United States and in Europe, the intellectual class, the intelligentsia more broadly, has not fully reckoned with. And I've been chewing on this idea for a very long time. So what do I mean by reckoning? I mean, what I don't mean, I guess I should make clear what I don't mean. This is not a paper which lays out specific policy prescriptions for how we should go about meeting the challenge of China. It's not. It's about psychology. It's about a deeply sort of personal reckoning that a lot of us need to make. And here I would not just include foreigners or Westerners, Americans. I would include in this many of my Chinese friends who are so used to the kind of reflexive comparison to the United States, who have seen the United States as sort of the norm and the form, its developmental model as sort of the established baseline against which it should always be comparing itself. Its developmental model as the only one that they can sort of imagine. I would include them. So what it is really is a call for us to really rethink our mental models, to jettison a lot of the old furnishings that no longer apply in a world where China has done what it has. Now, I anticipated a lot of pushback on saying something like this, and some of it has arrived. Have become so accustomed now to reciting what I call the litany of Chinese perfidy. Before we can say anything neutral or good about what China has done, we first feel compelled to go down this list of all the awful things. I decided I wanted to deliberately avoid doing that, to not rehearse that familiar list of perfidy in this essay, to only maybe flick at that. And I thought it'd be a controversial choice, but I have come to understand that is getting in the way of our clarity in our thinking. That is not to diminish these things. I think that they're very real, and maybe later on we can talk about that, as loath as I am to do. But there is, I think, a greater danger in saying too little than in saying too much.
Yeah, I think you make this point really, I think, really clearly and fluidly in the piece about there is always, it's a paradox. To understand China is to understand multiple things at once, right? There's always, the but youth unemployment, but, economic growth is less than it used to be, but, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, your point and the biggest sort of conceptual argument that you're making is about taking down some of the infrastructure that we have about thinking about what modernity looks like, what development models look like. And that is a there's a question that's about China, but it's also not only about China.
That's right.
And one of the things that you raise is this notion of race. And this idea that there is, as part of taking down some of the accepted norms and accepted infrastructure, is also accepting that perhaps a strong, perhaps the emerging strong global power is not going to be one dominated by Anglo peoples, and that is a real, I think, it requires a real reconceptualization of international relations, which, if we look at the history of it, right, international relations as a discipline came from race science. It came from the creation of hierarchies, and Darwinianism quite overtly came out of that discipline. And so you really touch, I think, on this bigger point about getting, we can always have the buts of China's day to day, but your point here is about sort of rethinking the infrastructure and the scaffolding for understanding China. So I wonder if you could build on that a little, most particularly, so you talk about this sort of the importance of reconsidering race within the sort of the American response to it. But you're also speaking about the ways that the United States needs to come to terms with and change its infrastructure in terms of its own crises. The crises within the United States cannot be simply, as Donald Trump might do and others, blamed on China. Right. That there needs to be a different sort of reconceptualization happening there too. So I wonder if you could unpack that for us too.
Sure, and it happens that the two things that you've raised here, the issue of race as part of this, and this question of the American reckoning. I mean, because let's face it, this is happening at a moment of American crisis. And this is really sort of drawn China's accomplishments, however we may think of them, in a very stark relief with the United States. One is I think on the descent. I don't mean to be parroting some line from the party or anything like that, but it's clear to me as an American. I mean, I went home for a couple of weeks this summer just so I could drive home my kids up to college, and two things dominated our discourse. One was about an advertisement for blue jeans starring with this woman named Sydney Sweeney, and the other was about a country-themed American crap restaurant called Cracker Barrel changing its logo. I mean, this is the level to which we've descended, that these dominated the Twitter feeds. But this whole business of the race thing, and I really only flicked at it in this particular piece, but I would encourage you all to find a piece that I wrote in the spring of 2020, the early summer of 2020. And it was in that year, in that moment, that I really, this became very, very clear to me. And if you'll remember, this is the time when, of course, we were in the first early horrific throes of the COVID pandemic, and the president at the time, Donald Trump, had very much racialized the pandemic itself. He had started to use, racial epithets, things like the Kung flu, the Wuhan flu, the China virus. There was a real spike in anti-API hate, in fact, in violent crime directed against people who looked like me and my family. So I took it, I felt it very personally. But at a policy level, you'll recall it was that late spring that he unleashed the dogs, as it were. He let flip the dogs of war, and in this case, it was every American agency and department. He sort of gave them their head and said, "Go after China," even to the point where the Ministry of the Interior, or the Department of the Interior, had banned the use of Chinese-made drones to do things like put out fires or detect, forest tree diseases or things like that. I mean, it was insane. But it was at this moment that there was another thing happening domestically in the United States that really heightened this for me, that made this clear, and that was the Black Lives Matter protests that, of course, really shook a lot of American cities at that time. And there was one image that really seared itself into my memory, which was of in St. Louis, where a white couple wearing sort of Izod Lacoste preppy wear, the man carrying an AR-15 and the woman brandishing a Glock pistol, walked out into their manicured suburban front lawn and point their guns at these black protesters, these BLM protesters. And it made me realize that what we're seeing in microcosm in the United States, which was the twilight, the visible end of white hegemony in the United States, seeing that in 30 years' time, the United States would, on its current trajectory, be a majority-minority country, and that we had all this replacement theory nonsense. We had all of this spasmodic paroxysm of inchoate violence directed against East Asians, directed against South Asians. And I realized that if you zoom out and look at the world, the white man of the world is the United States, and he's facing a similar twilight of his moment of hegemony, and realizing this. And again, there's a racial dynamic. The blame is cast at China. The COVID pandemic is used as sort of a convenient moment in which to unleash this pent-up nonsense. And so, I mean, I urge you, if you are not yet convinced, think about this. Think about what happened earlier this year, just 2 months ago, when Donald Trump got a bloody nose after trying to sort of take China on in a trade war, and then turned his attention to a foe that he thought he could more easily best, India. And he suddenly turned the full force of his odious hatred toward India, knowing, as he does, because if you give him credit for anything, it's for having that sort of low animal cunning about politics in America. He understood that there was deep-rooted anti-South Asian racism that had been percolating up since November of the year before, that over H-1B visas, over a kind of impolitic essay that Vivek Ramaswamy had written, basically encouraging Americans to buckle down and do their homework and learn math. There was a lot of this stuff that was happening, and he knew that he could harness this, that he could turn on Asia, because in his mind, and unfortunately in the American mind, there's still a connection between ethnically South Asian Americans and India, just as there is between ethnically East Asian Americans and China. So there was no doubt in my mind that this was a piece of it. But to connect it to the other piece of it,
yeah.
I mean, and I know I'm going on a little here, but it's this sense of crisis, this sense that we know that there's something fundamentally wrong. We know that we were sort of promised that our fidelity to process democracy, our fidelity to these values and these institutions, the pillars of American political culture, they weren't just supposed to yield justice. They were also supposed to yield results. They were supposed to enrich us. They were supposed to create material abundance. And that faith is what is really now challenged because of the economic downturn that we're now in. So it's this kind of simultaneous crises along multiple lines that are really accentuating China's rise and making us have to take a really sort of fresh look and to do things. And there's a moral dimension to this. I think this is something that we have always regarded in the liberal democratic West. We've always regarded the state as something against which we must be emancipated. So the state, the function of the state was always sort of as in an adversarial role. Like we defined ourselves in this post-Enlightenment period in terms of our ability to emancipate ourselves against the state and the clergy and all these things, but it was an emancipatory project. And China's rise inverts that. And that's one of the things that's most maybe morally painful, because the state plays an entirely different role there. It plays, I mean, it's in the Chinese path to modernity, the state is a steward of modernization, a guarantor, ideally, of social and economic justice. It's supposed to, this is I think the root cause of a lot of the moral panic that we're in right now is because of how far-reaching this reckoning really needs to go. Because it is not just a matter of adopting Chinese style industrial policy. It's not just a matter of putting the right incentives in place to reindustrialize and to begin innovating again. It's actually way beyond that. It's about rethinking something so fundamental to us, our relationship, a traditionally sort of adversarial relationship with the state itself.
Now, when you say "our," I want to dig in this a little. We're in the UK. We're in a European context, and even my own home country, where at least where I grew up, Australia. The relationship with the state, I would frame somewhat differently. Are you referring is this a US specific reckoning in this context that you're getting at here?
I think it goes beyond that. I think it actually goes beyond that. When I say the West, what I really mean are the countries of Northern and Western Europe that are sort of the inheritors of the Enlightenment tradition and their colonial offshoots. So I use the West. I know it's something that's contentious, but I have a very specific thing in mind when I say the West. So when I say the West, I do not mean Japan, although some people would include Japan or Korea. I actually mean the West.
Can I take us off piste for a moment?
Sure.
It's not in the questions I gave you, but it is a thought that I've been having, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And that is, so this is your point, right? And that you've just articulated, right? That this is a crisis of modernity in an Enlightenment sense, and that goes quite deep. My question for you is, what would you say to someone who might think, well, the real crisis is one perhaps of modernity, but perhaps also of liberalism, that we're living through the repercussions of a crisis of liberalism, and the distinctions there in those thoughts.
Right. So it's impossible to tease out liberalism and to separate it from this sort of cluster of other things that have gone with liberalism as it has developed historically. So I appreciate the question, but I think that what I am talking about is a cluster of ideas that do grow out of the tradition of the European Enlightenment, and those would certainly include, market economics, market-driven economics, the classical liberalism of that economic model. That's another thing that I think is very much being challenged right now. I think that. I alluded to this a little bit when I was talking about the role of the state, but it's been fascinating to see these very established ideas that are argued often quite forcefully by widely regarded economists now being really pushed back on heavily in social media and elsewhere by people who hold up the Chinese example as a counter to this. I'm talking about people like Brad Setzer or Michael Pettis, who tend to have what I think is a very sort of Western normative view of how political economy actually functions, who believe that there's a sort of, they're very mechanistic, they're capital accounts determinists in a way. Their ideas, I think, are really under assault right now, and they're being argued against every day, and I'm watching the kind of slow erosion of that kind of hegemonic position as well. That's part of this whole thing that's happening as well.
Yeah. One of the sort of so-called promises of sort of modernity is that things improve, right? That things get better, and this is the point that you're bringing out. So I think importantly is that we're living through a moment of crisis. We know the West specifically, but I think globally, and that one of the biggest points that you make in the piece, and I think more broadly, is about the way in which the climate crisis holds a mirror up to all of these ideas that you're discussing, and the ways in which this notion that we have been perhaps under an illusion of progress is sort of moving in a sort of particular direction of relative over time improvement. The climate crisis really, again, throws that question or that issue right into question. And could you sort of explain for us a little more what you mean by how this climate crisis does hold a mirror to these bigger points that takes us almost away from China in some ways, both to China and also beyond it?
I was looking for an analogy to a situation that should, I think, in ordinary circumstances, objectively be blindingly obvious to everyone. Something in which the accretion of facts that we have in hand should, by this point, have been enough to provoke crisis, a real, genuine sense of a need for a profound reckoning, for paradigmatic shift. And I landed on the climate crisis. I think it was pretty easy to come up with that, because that is a situation in which we all know about how badly we've exceeded every measure that we would try to sort of say we cannot go above 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial average global temperatures. We know about ocean acidification. We know that we are experiencing these once in a century storms now every couple of years. We know all these things. And somehow that hasn't added up to enough to make us go into genuine crisis, to respond to it in a way commensurate with the enormous size of the problem. I make this clear in the piece, I think. I don't mean to catastrophize China. China is not analogous in that sense that it is a catastrophe. In fact, I think it's not. But it is a question that has not been addressed with that kind of moral and intellectual clarity. And in that way, it resembles the climate issue. And of course, China itself is an actor in this whole climate thing. I mean, because it is responsible still for about 30% of annual CO2 emissions. But it is also the reason why in something like 80% of countries in the world today, renewable energy is cheaper than fossil energy because of its overcapacity, because of its production of so much affordable solar PV and wind, right? So there's just no question at all to me that these two reckonings need to be happening at the same time. I mean, the only honest people about this, in the public sphere would be like Al Gore and Greta Thunberg, right? I mean, it's really sort of strange to me. And again, I mean, a part of this is because of Tooze, because Adam Tooze himself has been working on a book about the green energy transition, and that's why he's taken such a keen interest in China. And so that's part of the reason why that metaphor became, or that analogy became so clear to me.
That's really interesting. I mean, the sort of dual, in many ways, in sort of your depiction, these dual obviousnesses, right? Obviousness of China's strength and the capacity to have raised so many people out of poverty, the obviousness of needing to act on climate. One of the things that you also address in this piece, but I'd love to hear you address, but I'd love to hear you tease out more, is sort of, in some ways, a contradiction of this of the developments that China has had over the last, I mean, when do you want to count? 40 years or so. That on the one hand, there's this real sense in which China has been able to lift so many people out of poverty, done so with a capacity to at least incorporate sort of Chinese culture, Confucianism, and its sort of, I suppose, Chinese characteristics, if you will. It's been able to sort of develop, in other words, a model of growth that is specific to its own context. Right. There is a thread within China that suggests that creates a sort of exceptionalism to that, right? That this is only China could do this, and only China could do this. This is about sort of the great power narrative, the re-rise of China, etc. But there's also an element to which some of the sort of bigger points you're making in terms of sort of the changes that have happened in China is asking us to rethink what we even mean by modernity. Right. There's a sort of, if we take that if we apply that thinking that I think you're really asking us to grapple with quite importantly, then it raises this question of, is this an exceptionalist model for China, or is this something that is able to be applied in sort of other contexts, particularly the global south? Is this asking us, as you're saying, to rethink and perhaps even throw away some of those economists, you know, the Pettises of the world, and sort of the assumed truths of economics more broadly as needing to be revamped? Is this about or capable of being applied elsewhere, or is this how do you see that unfolding?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastically good question. China, I think, does have its own form of exceptionalism, and I think you could even argue that it's equally hubristic, equally arrogant, but it is importantly not a proselytizing religion in the way that American exceptionalism is. American exceptionalism sort of posits that its institution and its values, its ordering of priorities is valid for all peoples in all times and should be sort of, you know, thrust upon them. China, let's look at it. If China really wanted to push its model of development into the world, maybe it would come up with a sexier name for it than Xi Jinping thought with Chinese characteristics on socialism for the new era, or whatever it's called. I mean, you know, maybe they would stop insisting that it is something with Chinese characteristics. I don't believe that is China's intention, but I think that very importantly, what it does do. So what China's pushing is not. It's pushing the idea of a pluralism of paths. It's not pushing a specific alternative path, but what it is doing is by showing an example of a national path to modernity that is different from the well-trodden one of the West. That is, I would argue, different from the path of even the East Asian powers. I've been in an interesting conversation about whether China's developmental path is simply an instance of the East Asian developmental model, or whether its scale, its steroidal quality gives it a quality all its own.
Yeah.
That's to be settled. But in any case, it's a different path. And it has, inarguably, in its earlier stages of development, adopted a lot of the paths of the Washington Consensus. It joined the Bretton Woods institutions. It took part in, but now it has moved to a period, a moment where it is selectively quite revisionist. It's changing a lot of the things. And it importantly opens up a menu of options for other countries. It becomes now imaginable, thinkable in minds of other developing nations that there is another way. And it may not it cannot adopt all the features. I mean, China is sui generis. China knows it's sui generis. I happen to agree that China is sui generis. I think, though, that a path that doubles down very, very hard on infrastructure spending, that is maybe export-led, that has a real focus on manufacturing, that has state participation, wise, foresightful, technocratic participation in economic development, suddenly becomes an option. It doesn't have to imitate China in every particular, but I think, there is space opened.
This is so interesting, and I don't know if my next question is going to be fair or not, but I'm going to ask it.
Can't wait.
It is on piece. I did give you a heads up, but it's sort of, I'm going to frame it slightly distinctly, which is, okay, China has modernized in its own sort of way, and it's shown, particularly the developing world, that is possible, right? It is shown that is possible, and that is such an important, as you're saying, thing to reckon with, particularly for those, I think, in the United States. To what extent is China's success in that capacity to have modernized, to what extent is that revolutionary, or is it simply a context-specific way of applying certain kinds of ways of development that other countries have also been distinct in. The United States is distinct from the United Kingdom, is distinct from Australia, etc. So to what extent is industrialization or a sort of an emphasis on manufacturing and the role of the state, to what extent is that upending international order and therefore perhaps revolutionary, or to what extent is that extending our current norms or our current ideas of modernity in a sort of more capacious way?
So here I run up against this sort of personality failure of mine, where I do have a lot of trouble pronouncing something as a paradigm shift, as a major, a true transition. My instinct is to say that, well, it's both. You know, it's like,
I'm a historian. We do that all the time.
Yeah, I mean, there are elements, but I think I'm going to try to be bold here, and I'm going to make the argument that it's more profound than just sort of that it's a change in kind, and for some of the reasons that I've talked about. I mean, I think some of the features are this idea of the role of the state and the sort of the new moral vocabulary that's introduced in this. It's wholly different in that way. I think that it certainly uses many of the features that were bequeathed to it by this sort of post-Enlightenment paradigm that we've been living in really since the Industrial Revolution, which is, of course, you know, the pricing mechanisms of the market and the labor market and all these things are still going to remain features of this new system. But I think that there's enough that has fundamentally changed that we can pronounce it a shift. I mean, and it mostly centers on the role of the state in the economy and just how that's conceived of. In that regard, it does not resemble that much. I mean, it goes so far beyond what we've seen with the Asian tigers and the East Asian development model. It has come up with a strange amalgam now. I mean, that I describe in this piece as having features of Confucianism and Leninism, of maybe Singaporean style technocratic authoritarianism, certainly elements of neoliberalism that remain in it. Earlier this evening, I was talking with Jane, or this heated debate over, is China socialist or capitalist? She has she's come down very hard on one side. I refuse to. See, it's both. I mean, it has features of both, and then some. Features of it that aren't described, that aren't captured by either of those words. So I'm going to insist on that. But gun to my head, I'm going to say that it's a bigger paradigm shift than I mean, that's why I wrote this thing. I mean, so that I could force myself to say these things that I would like. I think constitutionally, I'm really loath to say. I mean, people who know me understand that my project has always sort of been to work within and win the trust of an establishment. I mean, I put quite mainstream academics and think tankers on the show all the time. I don't challenge them very hard. I don't push them very hard. But they're selected to sort of try to move the discourse in what I believe to be a more sort of salubrious direction. I'm glad that you got here, Carrie, because I called your name out earlier as one of the people who had sort of inspired me to actually say the thing, because that's something that you do so well. I had a wonderful conversation with Carrie in Salzburg last year, and he did something that I thought was terrific. It's from his book, China Gives Up, the inversion of that basic question we're always asking: what does China want? Why don't we turn that on ourselves and say, what do we actually want from China? What is it that we want from China? And that was, I mean, I wanted to do something like that, to actually do something sort of bold and challenging. So
Well, Kaiser, I'm very glad that you did. And I think that, as I say, for those in the room who are not regular podcast listeners of Sinica Podcast, I think we've been, as a long-time listener, we've gotten hints, I think, for quite a while now of the real sort of thoughts that you've had and strength of ideas, and they've come out in other writings. But this, as I say, this piece, this reckoning that you're asking us to do, I think is very, very important. And so it's, it does need to happen. I still have personal, I still think, or I still want to hear a little more, if I may, about sort of, it's coming up actually from your conversation with that you referenced with Jane about, is China capitalist or communist, et cetera, like, or socialist. A different way of thinking about that, or framing that in relation to some of the ideas you're putting out here is, to think about just how embedded China is within the capitalist system. Regardless of what we might call China itself, it is a very core component of the capitalist world, of which, of course, the United States is too. I mean, as all countries. And so, to that degree, you're speaking about a sort of a real paradigm shift, as you're boldly putting it, and I think rightly so, a change in kind in terms of the role of the state. Right, the role of the state in the economy. But it's not a change in kind in terms of an international order. It's not a change in kind in terms of reliance on cars. They might be electric, but they're still cars. It's not a change in kind in terms of the overall power of which capitalist systems continue to work. And so in that sense, whether or not we label China sort of as a country capitalist or not, do you see this sort of reckoning that's happening in a broader sense as shifting perhaps the international order, the international economic order down the line? Do we see, and I'm not saying, look, I'm not naive enough to believe that revolution is particularly, I hold on to it as, thanks, Jane. But I mean, but perhaps changes in kind more broadly at an international economic space, even if it can't be the revolution we all deep down want.
So I think that nowhere was it ever written, or never was it fully agreed to, that competition among states would only be carried out by their private sector actors without the state putting its thumb on the scale. For some reason, Americans take great umbrage at the idea that there would now enter a competitor which would have this massively unfair advantage of having state participation. There's no way to resolve that except that other nations will have to put their thumbs on the scale. There's no way that China will be convinced that it will end all subsidies to enterprises. It will stop issuing 5-year plans where it directs investment. It will not stop doing that. So in that sense, it is fundamentally changing the way that global capitalism will work. There will now be state involvement, and we're seeing that happen. And it's no different than, than China in 1839 saying, well, no, the way the global trading system works is you give us silver, and then we give you tea, and we give you porcelain, and we give you silk. You need that's how it works. The West aggressively came in, the British especially, and busted that up with opium and with gunboats, right? And it was that sort of cathartic moment that really launched China into a destabilized state, where it could no longer hermetically seal itself off again thereafter. There was just not any way for that to happen. So too, the United States, it will find very soon that it is not able to do that. We will not be able to exclude a heavily state-involved actor from a global trading system. And so what we're seeing right now is the United States now taking on these trappings. We're seeing an embrace of industrial policy, whether we've not had in the United States a national conversation about this. This is something that has just happened per force. And we're seeing, the United States government taking large stakes in major strategically critical sectors, like in Intel, for example, in semiconductors. We're seeing things like the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips and Science Act. These are unequivocal instances of industrial policy. What's interesting is that when China tried to respond to the obvious military superiority of the West, it sought to preserve this Chinese essence by adopting the usage, the technology of the West. We're seeing that inverted right now, where the West, in order to protect its precious essence against Chinese competition, it finds itself having to adopt certain practices and institutions of China, including its effort to reindustrialize, so we're in a bizarre inverted world right now.
Yeah, this is definitely an inverted world. I wouldn't necessarily see this as adopting China, though. It's definitely responding to it, but it's also going back to how, the US had the New Deal. We did have back in the 18th, 19th centuries, company states, right? So in some senses, these aren't unfamiliar ideas or practices to the West or to the United States, but they are things that went by the wayside, partly, I think, as a rise of and the dominance of liberalism and movement towards neoliberalism towards the end of the 20th century. Which it gets to your point, though, about the ways in which China has sort of taken so many of those forces and taken them down a new direction, and is now forcing the United States to reconsider what those sort of structures of modernity and structures of change might look like.
We embraced those with like a almost religious fervor, though, and we've done so for long enough.
We, the United States.
We, the United States, and I think, to a great extent, Thatcher's Britain did as well. Embraced these things with this fervor that has made the psychic pain very, very profound in letting these things go. And that's sort of what I'm talking about. This is the sort of reckoning. You don't. It's bizarre now to see across the entirety of the American political spectrum. On the left, arguably the most potent political force is this abundance movement. It is shot through with China envy, right? They are now starting to repeat this thing like one man's overcapacity is another man's abundance. The libertarian quadrant of Silicon Valley, lots of China envy. Somebody, even Li Yan, who is not exactly a China booster, she wrote an article in the New York Times just the other day about this phenomenon of Silicon Valley China envy. And even on the MAGA right, for all the wrong reasons, they admire China for its law and order society. They seem to attribute its successes to its racial purity, to its being an ethno-state, a Han ethno-state, putting its minority populations in their place. It's sickening, but
Kaiser, so this point, though, is exactly why it's one of many reasons why I would argue the framework of thinking about the current world as a Cold War is so unuseful and so inaccurate. So leaving aside the economic interdependence that binds the United States and China, that never binds the United States and Soviet Union, to your point too, though, it's not a new Cold War precisely because if you look at the culture within the United States, there isn't the fear of China in the way that there was a fear of communism, a cultural fear of communism in the Soviet Union that was palpable and able to be politically motivated and mobilized. In the United States, when the TikTok ban came into place, all those Gen Zs were like, goodbye to my Chinese spy, right? And they don't parrot the same fears of China. I think that cultural dynamic and reckoning with China is another another sort of way of understanding why these sort of Cold War frameworks are so unhelpful and in fact dangerous. Like there is a politics behind it that's so dangerous. But Kaiser, I'm conscious that we're close to time, and I would love to open to the floor for a couple of questions. So I might just take maybe one or two together, and then we'll sort of wrap things up, because I wouldn't want to hold anyone from wine for too long. So I see a hand at the back, the person in the jumper with a collar, and down here at the front, a person in a black jumper.
Great, thanks for the talk, Kaiser and Elizabeth. Long-time fan of the podcast, so
Thank you.
Great to see you here. I have a question. Now, I haven't read your latest essay, so if this is invalidated by something that's in there, then feel free to just shoot this down. But I feel like I remember in a relatively recent podcast, you kind of quite forcefully asserted that you still kind of principally felt that you were a liberal.
Yeah. That was in a conversation with Yasha Monk, right?
I think it was before Yasha Monk. It was the guy who worked at State TV.
Okay, no, I remember.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering, do you still hold to that? And if so, do you feel the tension between that kind of principle or ideological commitment with the calls for kind of a reckoning in kind of liberal Anglophone culture? How do you thread that needle, to the extent that you even see it as a needle that needs to be threaded? Thank you.
If I didn't still hold myself to be a liberal, I wouldn't be experiencing the sort of anguish and be able to write about the anguish in first person as something felt personally. I do still consider myself to be a liberal in the sort of the sense that there's a book that I think that where I sort of derive my fundamental definition of what it is to be liberal. It's a book by Adam Hochschild. It's called A Thousand Small. Oh my God, I'm sorry. I'm spacing the name of this book, but it's essentially that I still have. Look, I mean, I'm liberal in the same sense that I'm a Confucian. I mean, it's a product of upbringing more than anything else. I mean, instinctive liberal. I mean, not an intellectual liberal in that if I were to lay out and sort of, perform an autopsy on my current views, there would be a lot of cognitive dissonance with things that I know to be true and my own emotional commitments. But I know in my heart of hearts where my instincts still draw me, and so that is an act of confession when I declare my allegiance to liberalism. I hope that answers your question, but I'm a liberal in the throes of change right now. We'll see. Ask me in 6 months.
Shall we collect two questions
I'm sorry.
at the front? And because I am conscious that we're getting.
I couldn't resist that one.
I would actually like a bit of a balance of gender too. So maybe one question here and one question here, and then we can. So just right, this person here with their hand right up.
Hi.
So my question is that this sort of this reckoning, when you're talking about it, do you think it would also create an impact on how we think about democracy and freedom of speech? Because coming from India, I always had this assumption that democracy and development will go hand in hand, and freedom of speech and innovation will go hand in hand, and ultimately, like, you can't be an innovative country and a highly developed country without being democratic and having a lot of freedom of speech. But China is sort of showing that perhaps you can have both these things without having like democracy or freedom of speech in the way that we think of it.
Can we hold that one and also we've got one person here with their hand very high up earlier. We'll take it and then that's it. I got told we could go slightly over, so that's...
It's very hard to follow that question, which is excellent. But can you say a little bit about, as I understand, I haven't read the article, as I understand it, you're talking about the West having to redefine modernity. Can you say a little bit more about the features that redefinition needs to encompass beyond economic development?
Kaiser, you've got the last word.
Okay, so just these two questions then.
Yeah.
So first, to your very excellent question, I actually addressed this in the piece that I wrote, where, I mean, and I've talked about this quite a bit. I think there are quite a number of these features that are not exclusive to, but are certainly sort of load-bearing pillars or load-bearing walls in the American exceptionalist canon. Beliefs, for example, that you can't have a functioning free market economy without political democracy. You can't have innovation without freedom of speech. That you cannot, that technologies themselves has sort of an emancipatory will, that the advent of social media was going to be an existential threat to authoritarian regimes the world over. There were more of them, that, the market must decide who the national champions are and not the state. Lots of these things that are pillars of American exceptionalism, but have also, because of American discourse power, because of the power of the Enlightenment project, have spread to many geographies around the world, including in India. China has been a challenge to all of these pillars. It's not one after another out. The idea of what I would call the innovation narrative, the emancipatory narrative, these things, I think China is just demonstrably disproving before our very eyes, and that's deeply problematic to people who've held to them, and that's what is causing the kind of cognitive dissonance and the kind of psychic pain to a lot of people. That's what I think is causing a lot of people to lose their faith. They believed that this kind of prioritization of civic and political rights over things like economic rights, that would lead invariably to, human flourishing. It would lead to wealth. And when that doesn't pan out, when that doesn't seem to be true, when you lose the potency of that of procedure as a foundation of legitimacy, and you don't have performance legitimacy either, and so you cling to other forms of legitimacy like nationalism, and so that's part of the reaction that we're seeing in the United States right now, and it's quite natural, and it's I think, sort of dying throes. But it's a dangerous moment to be in when we're seeing that reaction to it. So I hope that addresses it. Your question. So was it Gramsci said that the old has not died and the new is struggling to be born? We don't know what all the features of this are yet. I think that you've asked me not to talk about state as like a major element in it, but that is, I think, its defining feature. That is what I would say is its most salient feature, is the way that the state inserts itself into economic activity, and so we're not just talking about. I think morally, though, there's another piece to it. It is a challenge to a prioritization that has become sort of, it's become catechism in the West, to put civil and political rights above economic rights. I think that we're entering a world where a plural ordering of priorities is now being made possible, where it's possible to have a society where you can put economic rights ahead of, because of some maybe belief in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that you as China has been arguing for a very long time, that civic and political rights will inevitably flow or eventually flow from realization of basic economic rights. I've always had a problem with this idea that there's only one acceptable way to prioritize these values. I think that I reject out of hand, a sort of total nihilistic relativism that says, there are no values. I think that in every society on earth, we actually do share a number of them, that they're given different priorities. But what the main feature of it, the economics aside, is this willingness to accept variant prioritizations of values in our polities. That's what I would say.
Kaiser, you have asked us to reckon, and I think, judging by the number of hands and the number of people in this room, you've really done so, and thank you for that. It's been a real pleasure to be in conversation with you. It's been a real pleasure to sort of be here. Thank you to the Lao Centre.
You should start a podcast. You'll give me a run for my money.
Give you a run for your money.
Fantastic questions. Let's give it up for.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. It's been really fun, and I do believe that there is. I've been promised wine. Yes, we are moments away. So thank you, Kaiser. We can continue the conversations, and I really hope to do so. Thanks.
Thank you.